Okay. Hi, I'm Josh Blakeney, President of Solidarity for Palestinian Human Rights in Lethbridge, Alberta, Canada. I'd like to introduce you to my fellow activist and former president of this group, Farah Al-Alami. And this is journalist Ben White. He's the author of a new blockbuster entitled Israeli Apartheid, A Beginner's Guide. And he would like to discuss some of the concepts and some of the sort of themes that are running through his book. So tell me, Ben, it sounds like quite a controversial phrase, Israeli apartheid. What do you mean by this?
Right. The key thing to remember is that when you talk about Israeli apartheid, you're not saying that Israeli policies past and present are the same as what happened in historical South Africa. There are some comparisons to be made with South Africa, similarities and differences. But the key thing is that apartheid actually has a definition in various international treaties. And you can assess a particular situation based on these definitions to see whether it meets the criteria for being apartheid. Yeah. And in the case of Israel, past and present, myself and others feel that Israel's policies of ethnic cleansing, of land confiscation, of essentially securing the domination of one group at the expense of another over a particular piece of territory match that definition of apartheid.
Okay. So Farah, tell me, what's your kind of agenda in Canada as an activist? What do you feel has been most, what propelled you to form Solidarity for Palestinian Human Rights in Lethbridge?
It was shocking to me when I first found out that not enough people were aware about the situation in Palestine. Too few knew, and the very few who knew, unfortunately, had misconceptions about the whole situation. And I felt like in order for change to happen, people need to know what needs to be changed. And thus, this is why here I would love to raise awareness, bring about education about the situation, give people the information to decide for themselves where they stand, instead of blindly following what the media is feeding them, or just being indifferent to the situation and standing back and watching while innocent people are being killed, prosecuted, treated unjustly and unfairly. So this is what I'm trying to do, hopefully here in Canada. We need to raise awareness, and through this maybe pressure our own governments to do something about it, and to bring human rights issues onto the table and talk about them.
You mentioned the media in Canada. It strikes me that it seems on this issue to be a kind of fabricated hysteria, an attempt to portray something that, if you look at it in legal terms, in terms of international law, is not particularly controversial or complicated. Perhaps, Ben, you may address why you think it is that throughout the world, Canada, Australia, Britain, the US, there seems to be this kind of one-sidedness or this hysteria whenever this topic, especially with language such as apartheid, enters discourse.
Sure. I mean, for a long time, there have been important reasons for geopolitical reasons for why a country like the US has wanted to offer Israel what increasingly amounted to unconditional support, especially in recent decades. And the way that Israel fits into the US's broader geopolitical strategy in the Middle East. You also have the role of different interest groups, so Zionist lobby groups from within the Jewish community, Zionist lobby groups within the Christian community as well, who obviously who organise to try and influence things. So I mean, these are some of the reasons why there's been why it's still an uphill battle in many ways to get governments like the UK government, the American government, Canadian government to enforce, or to at least attempt to enforce, the international law that they pay lip service to.
Yeah. So, when you watch the Arab media, Farah, and contrast it with the Canadian media, you've grown up in Canada, and when you say watch CBC or you read the National Post, the Globe and Mail, do you feel that which of the two do you think is doing its job of being objective and trying to show both sides of the story? Could the Arab media be accused of being biased, or do you find it tends to try and offer both perspectives when compared to the Canadian media?
There's more than one side to every story, and everybody knows that. The media can try and do its best to tell you the whole story, but rarely is that the case. It's hard for a journalist to be expected to be objective about a situation when they're in it, and this is the case for a lot of the Arab journalists. But from what I do see is that there is more coverage of both sides. Some may say that it is leaning more pro-Palestinian side, but nonetheless, I see both sides when I watch that media. In comparison to Western media, which unfortunately seems to neglect a whole side of the story, that seems to neglect the fact that Palestine is in fact occupied territories, that Palestinians actually are people who have faces and names and ages and families. All you hear are statistics, and if you do hear about the Palestinians to begin with. So to sum it up, I'd say that watching Middle Eastern news would give me a broader idea of what's actually happening on the ground.
And it strikes me that when we use language like perhaps the Arab media falls on the side of the Palestinians, we have to remember that international consensus falls on the side of the Palestinians. So it seems to me that for a media not to fall on the side of the Palestinians would put them in the minority as extremists or a fringe element. Of course, every year in the United Nations, about 180 countries are on one side voting for 292, and the only a minority of countries, the US, for political imperialist reasons, obviously Israel and some South Sea Island countries. I believe Robert Mugabe's Zimbabwe was there last time, and so it strikes me that if the accusation or the allegation that the Arab media, Al Jazeera, Press TV, and so on, fall on the side of international consensus, they're not really that radical at all. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, you're right to point out the fact that there is an international consensus. There is a wealth of international resolutions passed by the General Assembly year after year, affirming various things like the rights of the Palestinian people to self-determination, the legality of the Israel settlement enterprise, and that sort of thing. So this really highlights the fact that the conflict isn't as complicated as some people try to present it. You know? We can often hear that it's very complex, that there are all these different complicated factors. It's not that there aren't a lot of complicated factors happening, but the root of the Palestine question is more simple than can be, than is sometimes made out to be.
Yeah. So you have gone quite in depth in your book, although it's not a big book, but I think you've done a good job of deconstructing and demystifying apartheid. People will say, in Palestine there's not Jewish toilets and Arab toilets. There's not benches for Arabs and so on. Could you define Israeli apartheid as opposed to South African apartheid?
Well, this is because in the public imagination, apartheid from the South African context is associated with these what has been called petty apartheid in terms of openly publicly racially segregated areas, this sort of thing. Whereas in fact, as I try and make clear and others point out, and as I was mentioning earlier, to talk about Israel and apartheid isn't to try and say that it's the same as South Africa. Israel's legal infrastructure is very different. And as well, when Israel was created, Israel's leaders were well aware that there was a battle for public opinion, internationally speaking.